Seems that players of the forces of the Tau Empire are in for a bit of a shake-up in 10th edition. Looks like drones are just war gear now, Markerlight counters don't really exist, and there's no more picking of tactical philosophers. Still looks like there's plenty of interesting things to be done with 40k's young race of high-tech gunslingers, though I feel like 10th edition Tau's going to have a very different feel. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today we're talking 10th edition 40k once more, and this time we're checking in with the forces of the Tau Empire and how they're going to be doing in the new edition. As per normal with Games Workshop's previews, they've given us a fair few details as to how the faction's going to work. We have got the entire army rule and the detachment rule shown off, plus a few previews for some interesting big guns and one called Transport Stratagem, and a datasheet for some Pathfinders and some drone stats. For perhaps some of the headline news, it seems that Markerlight tokens are basically gone. They're going to be rolled into the faction's core mechanic, a fairly interesting way of pairing units, though I feel like putting tokens on units by zapping them with Markerlights might be something that's missed by some just for the feel for it. Drones are apparently not counting as individual miniatures anymore, basically they're just war gear with abilities for the units that have them. And again, that is going to be something that shakes up the way that you play the faction quite a bit. Quite a lot at the moment, you have drones in a unit basically to tank damage as kind of ablative bullet catchers, and that means that's really not going to be the case, at least for the vast majority of them. Tau players will typically have a whole ton of drones in their collection. I'll be interested to hear what people think about using those basically as counters as opposed to models from now on. I feel like it maybe does have some positives and downsides. On the one hand, I feel like drones probably are things that your opponent should probably need to kill to actually deal with the Tau forces. Seems a bit weird that they can just basically ignore them, particularly if they're gun drones that are taking aim at them. But on the other hand, I do admit it probably made some Tau units kind of hard to balance. Things like battlesuits, for example, they were always in a bit of a weird durability place, as if you had some big tough battlesuits, then you could be firing las cannons at them, they just get tanked on the drones, then you get hit by a whole bunch of light anti-infantry shots, and they get tanked on the battlesuits. I guess this is one way of dealing with them, and at least it looks like all the drones are still going to be adding something pretty interesting. We do have a fairly good look at their abilities. It seems that big things with little auxiliary units attached, like say Riptides with the shielded missile drones, that maybe answers some questions for how they're going to be working in 10th. Otherwise for the faction, it seems that from the Pathfinder datasheet we've got a standard leadership of 7+, at least for your foot troops. It might be possible that some battlesuits get slightly better than that, though if things like the Imperial Guard are anything to go by, their biggest and baddest units also got the same low leadership. Finally, for army trends, it looks like their ballistic skill is still going to be remaining 4+ for most things besides drones that hit on 5s, but it does look like a lot of things have easy ways to improve to either 3+ or perhaps even 2+ through a combination of things like heavy keywords and their core faction mechanics. Otherwise, though, for the previews, their army rule is for the greater good. Basically, units pair together to mark targets for each other, better with Markerlights. It's kind of weird that Kauyon is their launch detachment. Looks like there's no option to play Montcar currently, and there won't be until the Tau Codex comes out. Looks like the Tau are going to have to be patient little hunters for their codex. It looks like this one remains a simple but brutally powerful damage buff towards the end of the game. Otherwise, it looks like we've got rules for the Railgun and the Storm Surge's big pulse cannon, one nice stratagem to allow breachers to re-embark in transports, and then the datasheet for some Pathfinders and some common drone abilities. Let's jump into the details. First up, and seemingly replacing Markerlights, is this greater good mechanic. This is their new faction rule, and the way that it works is that it seems that you have to pair off units in your shooting phase, one of them basically acting as spotters for the other, and the other one getting a damage boost, primarily with ballistic skill but also maybe with ignored cover. If you've got Markerlights in your unit, it now looks like that gives you a keyword on the unit, you don't fire them off and put tokens on the enemy. Might decrease the importance of having multiple Markerlights in one squad. The way it works is that you pick two different units that are about to shoot. They can't be units that are either battle shocked, falling back, or advancing. Basically, it has to be a unit that's eligible to shoot, and things like falling back and advancing prevent that. When you've picked your two units, they must both be able to draw line of sight to one enemy target unit, and they designate that the spotted unit. The unit that you're less bothered about the damage output of, that counts as an observer unit, and the other one counts as a guided unit. I believe that you nominate observer units for this, so that they basically can't be guided units themselves later in the phase. Then the unit that's guided basically gets two different buffs provided they're shooting at the spotted units. The big hitting one is a +1 to their ballistic skill, so generally speaking that's usually going to be hitting on a 3+ rather than a 4, but for some weapons with a heavy keyword it looks like that might go up from a 3 to a 2. The modifier is a +1 to your ballistic skill, not to a hit roll, so that gets around any overlapping hit roll modifier restrictions that 40k has, so quite nice for the Tau there. It also means that even if your opponent's got multiple stacking negative modifiers, I guess you'd be hitting on a 4+ at worst. Then, as an addition, if the observer unit also happens to have a marker light, you also get to ignore the benefit of cover as well with your guided units. All very fluffy and appropriate there, I suppose. Interestingly though, it doesn't go all one way. It seems that the unit being guided does actually have to focus on the targets that is being spotted for them. If they fire at other things, then you actually worsen their ballistic skill by 1 against those attacks. That would mean that anything split firing into other targets would often be hitting on a 5+ rather than a 4, so that's really going to be a big downside to their damage output there. I feel like this incentivizes basically having a big unit that wants to shoot at just one thing, and then having one unit spot for them, probably a small unit with a marker light. I guess this could be a little bit rough for really big things with a whole ton of guns, maybe broadsides that might want to aim at different targets rather than just focus down one thing, or perhaps a Storm Surge which has got lots of anti-infantry small guns as well as some really big ones. In general though, I think it's usually going to be worth it for the buff. You're going to be amping up the majority of their firepower, and then you can decide whether other little guns could go into the same target or go elsewhere. Overall, it does seem fairly straightforward. I think that it might make a big impact on how Tau players build their list, with lots of small units and a few big ones for the buffs. And I think overall it does make marker lights just a bit less critical to have. They'll certainly be nice against some armies that use cover in a big way, but I think it's far more important to have the +1 ballistic skill than the ignore cover, and you get that without even having a marker light in the unit that's observing. Overall seems solid enough. A lot of the most important Tau firepower will still be hitting on a 3. Then, in what I thought was a bit of a surprise, is that their core detachment appears to be Kauyon. Previously in 9th edition they had their tactical philosophies, and you could either pick Kauyon or Montcar at the start of the game, depending on whether or not you wanted a movement boost or damage boost and fall back towards the end of it. The Tau Codex isn't expected to be out anytime soon, and it's kind of a bit weird to be locking all Tau armies into one of those two major tactical philosophies for the faction. I kind of would have expected them to do something a bit more generalist and not really go down one of these too hard for the generic one, I suppose. I guess Farside Enclaves are going to be embracing the ways of Kauyon for a bit until they get the Codex. As before, it's a kind of interesting faction rule. Basically, you get no benefit towards the start of the game, but then from Battle Round 3+, you get a massive damage boost to your shooting. It's a bit of a weird one, as it basically means that your army is going to be a bit underpowered in the early game, and often you really want to be making some big gains, say turn 1 and turn 2, so your opponent doesn't build up too much critical momentum. But I feel like the sheer amount of damage boost that you get from turn 3 onwards really is very meaningful indeed. The way that this one works again is really quite simple. You get sustained hits 1 on literally all your guns from turn 3 onwards, so that's exploding 6s to hit. If you're hitting on a 4+ anyway, then that would usually be a big 33% boost to your damage. Very nice indeed. If your unit is guided though, then it gets even better. That one gives you sustained hits 2, so basically any hit roll of a 6 that you get an additional 2 hits on your target, and that could sometimes apply to really powerful guns indeed. Say for example, if you hit the jackpot with your Railgun, rolling a 6 will hit the target 3 times with that crazy profile. In general though, it is just going to add a lot of firepower to any gun in the army pretty much equally. Whichever way you look at it, the sustained hits 2 is absolutely massive for guided units. If you compare it to a guided unit that was hitting on a 3+ without the buff, it'd basically be a 50% increase to have Kauyon. That's absolutely enormous and better than the vast majority of character boosts in Warhammer 40k. It really is pretty massive. You could also compare the damage to what you'd get in Kauyon in a unit without guided, and again that's an extra 50% damage there. Whichever way you look at it, it's a huge damage increase to units that already had their damage buffed. Overall, this one's really quite an interesting one, I think. It means that Tau armies will almost certainly be more efficient than their opponents towards the end of the game, and it kind of might make them feel a little bit like White Scars at the moment in 40k, very tempted to hold on until they get their massive damage boost later and play a bit cagier earlier on. That does feel kind of fluffy for Kauyon, to be honest. You still need to engage to some extent and fight over the midfield objectives for some points early, but if you can manage to have a few units deliver a really big blow turn 3, you could deal some pretty critical damage, maybe things arriving from reserve or jumping out from behind line of sight blocking terrain. Overall, I think I would generally be a little bit skeptical as to mechanics that gave you big damage boosts towards the end of the game, but I feel like this one is powerful enough that it's probably meaningful and will be a strong one. Moving on, we've got the new drones rules, and as mentioned, it looks like these are just literally upgrades for the battlesuit or infantry model that can take them. It is going to be kind of weird them not really having a defensive profile. I kind of wonder if they might still get some sort of stratagem for saviour protocols, which if you've got a drone in the unit, they might be able to tank a hit. Going down the list though, and the Guardian drone looks pretty excellent as a damage debuff for Fire Warriors. That's -1 to the wound roll when you make ranged attacks at it. I feel like if that's cheap enough, then that could be great. The gun drone hits on 5s with its twin-linked pulse carbines, which now have a 20-inch range. That one gets the assault keyword, so interestingly it could advance and shoot, where it looks like quite a lot of the units in the squad wouldn't be able to. Looks like the regular Pathfinder pulse carbine at least doesn't have the assault keyword. I guess it's possible that the crisis weapons might still be assault though, or maybe some of the other fire warrior options. The marker drone basically gives you the Markerlight keyword for your unit, and you can count as being an observer unit even if you're advanced. Seems handy enough to add into really quite small units maybe, or perhaps even Tau characters still. If you've got a cheap Tau character with one of these in tow, then you could support other units I guess. The missile drone just adds a little bit of firepower, pretty similar in character to how it is now. And then the shield drone has perhaps been changed the most. Rather than giving you an extra couple of wounds with an invul save, it now just literally adds +1 to the bearer's wound characteristic. That's absolutely definitely weaker rather than having an auxiliary profile with a couple of wounds and an invul, though I guess it might mean that shield drones have changed drastically in cost. If they're cheap enough, still could be worth it I suppose. I guess when we get the full datasheets it'll be a bit more apparent as to whether they're worth it for things like crisis suits or broadsides. In any case, it's going to be a very different way to run drones. Tau players are effectively going to have a fair few less models on the table with this I suspect. Next up, Games Workshop like showing off their great big anti-tank guns, and this time we've got the Railgun and the Storm Surge gun. The Railgun was definitely a scary beast in 9th edition, ignoring invul saves. It looks like along with things like the Leagues of Votan Railgun, it no longer ignores invuls at base. Same as that, you have to get lucky and roll a 6 for the devastating wounds. Realistically, that does mean that it's just going to be a lot less general purpose than it is now. You can't just look at just about any knight or other target and just smash straight through the invuls, no questions asked. Anything with an invul is going to have a decent chance to save, and opponents will often want to CP reroll it if they fail. But it's still going to be pretty brutal against anything without an invul save, and occasionally you're going to get lucky and roll that 6 to wound as well. Otherwise, for its stats, it's got heavy, so it'll be hitting on 3+ if it's stationary, or I guess 2+ if guided. It's got 1 shot at strength 20, AP 5, and damage d6 +6. Sounds very scary, though not really anything too different to what it is now I think. Strength 20 still means it'll be wounding things like land raiders and repulsors on a 3+, not a 2. Without any buffs, and if it's hitting on a ballistic skill of 3+, either due to moving or not being guided, you average around about a 55% chance to get your 7 to 12 wounds on a toughness 10 target, or around about 44% chance for toughness 11+. It's not odds on unless you've got other rules. I think it's pretty possible that the Tau Empire is going to have hammerhead shooting rules on its datasheet though, and you certainly could feed this thing CP rerolls due to it being a big investment one-shot. Given these rules though, at least in isolation, I feel like it's likely to lose a bit of relevance unless it winds up being undercosted compared with other options. They've also shown off the Storm Surge gun, as they like showing off the biggest guns around. Again, I feel like this is one of the profiles that people get very excited about when they see the big damage 12 and AP 6, but compared with how it is now, it is pretty much the same to be honest. And ever since they jacked up the points by quite a bit, the Storm Surges don't tend to see as much play as they did before. They're not really considered to be the mainline heavy lifters of the Tau army right now, not compared with things like Riptides, Crisis Suits, Broadsides or Hammerheads. There's a few small changes to this. It's got the heavy keyword, so if you stand stationary you hit on 3s. Might be a little bit hard with the focus one and the 24-inch range though. The focus one gains some strength to put it in line with 40k's new stretch toughness chart, and the disperse mode has lost a little bit of strength. It is going to be a little bit underwhelming against most vehicles now. In general though, this profile hasn't changed enormously. It's going to more depend on how good Storm Surges are overall than this gun. Next up though, we've got a rather fun stratagem for things like breaches and devilfish. Quite a nice simple reactive one for 1 CP, which you get to trigger when your opponent tries to charge a unit that's right next to one of your transports. With the way that transports work in 10th edition, the breaches are still going to be able to do their signature move. The devilfish are going to be able to zoom them onto a midfield objective. They can jump out, take the objective, and lay down a bunch of close range pulse blaster fire. That means that the squad will be within 3-inch range of the devilfish after they got out of it, and this stratagem gives them a really nice fall back type maneuver, where if your opponent can't deal with them in shooting and needs to charge them, you can trigger this for 1 CP, and the breaches jump back into your devilfish. Your opponent is able to redeclare their charges. I feel like this one's going to be very meaningful when it goes off. Some things are going to be absolutely excellent at shredding infantry that might struggle with the new higher toughness of vehicles in 10th. You definitely could have things that could absolutely mulch the breaches but not hurt the devilfish too much, so hiding behind that thick armour seems good. Even if the thing could potentially kill the devilfish, it might not be the end of the world. The breaches should survive the encounter and be ready for another round of shooting next turn hopefully. Maybe a little bit unit specific this one, but seems like a good incentive to run breaches in devilfish or something similar in 10th. Finally, unlike a fair few of the other faction previews, looks like we just get the one datasheet this time, I guess because they've showed off the profiles for all the drones. The Pathfinders are a fairly interesting one to see, I suppose, gives us a few ideas of base things for the faction, and for their core stats it looks like they've got a leadership of 7+, and their armor's been improved to a 4+ save, as previously they counted as having lighter armor than Fire Warriors on a 5. Looks like their signature datasheet ability is they will be sticking with their Markerlights. They get to count as observers for 2 different units, so I guess that could make them quite efficient rather than having a whole bunch of small spammed units that don't cost very many points. Still though, I feel like Tau Empire can still field a fair few small units, maybe small things like piranhas. They might be a bit more tempting to use in coordinated engagements. Otherwise, looks like they retain their 7-inch pre-game scout move. Their pulse rifles have dropped a little bit in range down to 20 inches from 24, no enormous changes there, and they don't have the assault keyword on this datasheet it would seem. Then they've got a bunch of fun special weapons. The ion rifle looks like it'll be a little bit less hazardous to them now. Rather than slaying the model on any hit roll of a 1 out of any of the 3 shots, it only takes the 1 hazardous test, so that's probably a buff there, even if the middling strength isn't going to be quite as good against vehicles now. The rail rifle does look really quite scary though, a single shot that hits at strength 10, AP4 and damage 3, though it does mean that if you're on the move, you're going to be fairly inaccurate with these things, hitting on a 5+, not a 4. Then we get the preview of 3 more drones that are unique to the Pathfinders. Grav inhibitors worsen charges by 2. Pulse accelerator drones increase the range of those carbines to 26 inches. Might or might not be relevant, to be honest, they don't generally tend to be the most punchy of the Tau guns. And perhaps one of the most interesting ones is the recon drone, which allows them forward deployment. If that's cheap enough, that could be pretty interesting to have them actually start in the midfield. A little bit more powerful than the scout move, I think, as it lets them screen out other enemy units a bit more. Not sure whether that will turn out to be worth it though. If you have to take them in a 10-man unit, that's quite an expensive squad for doing such. Overall, I do feel that they're interesting. I'm not 100% convinced that they're going to be super necessary to the Tau combined arms unless they happen to be fairly points efficient though. I feel like just being a little bit more efficient for observing units maybe doesn't feel enormously unique compared with some things, if you could just have that done by 2 cheaper units. Overall though, some pretty big changes for the Tau Empire. I'll be interested to hear what you guys make of the changes to things like drones and marker lights. Is this going to be better or worse for the Tau going forward in 10th? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.